Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at Carnegie. Welcoming in a minute, Josh Goodman from the AP, who's going to talk to us about a story that hasn't been covered a lot, which is the parts of the supply chain that are not disclosed to us, the public, but that matter very much at the doorstep. But before that, I wanted to speak with you, Nick, because I saw in my feed lots of protests going on in the city. Everybody's talking about the Van Gogh being destroyed by the Just Stop Oils. Actually, the piece is fine. It's fine. But there's a lot of movement on climate here and in the UK. There are going to be big protests here this weekend on climate. But the other big protests, so I don't know, are we in the era of protests again is perhaps the meta question. But the other big protest that's happening that I thought was fascinating and talks to what we've been talking about, this idea that people are connected in ways that national governments aren't really addressing. So there is this big protest planned this weekend with Iranians and Ukrainians joining together to fight for their voices, human rights, world attention. And I thought that was a fascinating combination. Have you seen it? What do you think?
I think it really speaks to a breaking down of barriers and a recognition that many of the struggles that people are engaged in are interconnected. A number of years ago, when we've had human rights violations or wars, war crimes, you often had a sense of, well, that's different. How am I affected by it? Why is this my concern? My issues are my issues, your issues are your issues. And now what we're seeing is, as you said, a growing sense of the interconnectedness. The protest movements in Iran against the Islamic Republic, particularly focusing on the issue of women's rights, but just questions of democracy in general, and Ukrainians who are fending off an invasion in which the Islamic Republic has been transferring capabilities to Russia. But the understanding that these are linked struggles for freedom, struggles for human rights, struggles for dignity, and that that old Polish slogan, right, for your freedom and ours, is actually taking on a new meaning in this era. That the freedom of Iranian women and the freedom of Iranians to choose their own destiny is connected to Ukraine's ability to enjoy the rights of self-determination and peace. We're also seeing a parallel movement where Syrians and Ukrainians are working together to try to track serial war crimes abusers. That Russian personnel in Syria who are now deployed in Ukraine, that perhaps we can detect and hold people accountable for things that they have done. And again, in years past, those would have been separate stovepiped protests. The Syrians would be in one bucket, the Ukrainians in another. But now this idea of them all coming together, and that, yes, the borders don't perhaps matter. And some of this, again, is also, as you said, when we had our almost 2 years ago with Dr. Tyree about talking about are we in a new movement of protest? I think that we are, and I think that people are realizing that these causes are interconnected in a way that before these would have been much more stovepipe protests, the Ukrainian protest, the Iranian protest, as opposed to these things coming together.
Yeah, and I want to add, I think people are connecting over social media, even though all the tech stocks have tanked. We'll talk about that another time, but they are feeling this interconnectedness that drove us to create this podcast in the first place, borderless internet. And I think they're really feeling that. I think young people are especially feeling that. In my classes, the cause of Iranian women is as passionate, and has nothing to do with the fact that we don't like Iran, they're a pariah government, and the US government's, it has everything to do with the humanity of it. And so I'll be interested to see how this weekend pans out, and we'll talk more about it in later episodes. And now I do want to go back to this idea because we are pre-midterms, and I think I want to tease that we're going to do a special election podcast next week, looking at what these young people are thinking and doing and acting on. And perhaps one of the issues is going to be, inflation, shipping, the shipping supply chains, and the ethics of them. And so we'll head over to Josh right now to talk more about that. Thanks so much for joining us today, Josh. There are so many articles that you write that I want to talk about, but today I really want to focus on your recent piece, U.S. businesses propose hiding trade data used to trace abuse, primarily because we are coming up to an election where everybody's talking about inflation and everybody's talking about shipping and how we don't have stuff and how that's cost. But what I don't think people are talking about is this other aspect that you cover in this piece that I feel is so important in the conversation of higher costs and shipping containers being stuck in ports and things not getting to you. I think is lost this lack of oversight of this multi-trillion-dollar industry. And this is what your piece covers. And this is what I want to talk about today. At Carnegie, we look at the ethics of issues that we cover. And you very much talk about this, the ethics of the supply chain, where goods come from, and this effort of transparency and an effort not to have transparency. And so let's go to the beginning so readers really understand this piece, and in terms of understanding what we as consumers, as the doorstep, what do we have a right to know? What kind of access to trade data should we have? You've looked into a little bit about this history of trade data, and frankly, I was shocked about what we don't have, but I'll let you maybe take us through a little bit of the background of what we have access to and what we should have access to.
Yeah, I was shocked as well. It's actually surprisingly not so much that we have access to as the public. Our trade rules really date back to the 1930s. The Tariff Act that we hopefully learned or still learn in high school in the 1930s was really to sort of prevent cheaper imports to come into this country, made sometimes from slave labor. So there's actually been laws on the books for almost a century that try to protect American manufacturing from unfair foreign competition. However, those were written in the day when trade internationally was still a relatively small part of our economic matrix. So, it allows the public access, for example, to data filled out on customs forms on only items that are coming into our country by ships, by vessels. And what people perhaps don't know is that that's about only 50% of the goods that come into the country every year. Everything that comes in on trucks from Mexico and Canada, rail from those two countries, especially from air freight, which is a very booming part of trade, especially for high value, low weight items like diamonds, gold, et cetera. Those items we know almost nothing about. Now, the Customs and Border Protection, they do know, they see the forms. But I think what needs to be said here is that, there is so much trade, $2.7 trillion a year of goods coming in and out of this country, that Customs and Border Protection, although, I think they're well intended and they have all these laws on the books to make sure that supply chains are clean, not using forced labor, they can't do it all. And in fact, a lot of items and containers don't get inspected. And that's why it's important for the public, journalists and activists, NGOs, lawyers, to really be able to, sort of size up the data themselves. We can sort of be citizen inspectors, if you will, for the goods that are coming into the country and hopefully identify, as the AP and other journalists have done, cases which deserve greater scrutiny, whether that is, shrimp being made by Philippine fishermen, being basically held in slave-like conditions aboard vessels, whether that's Uyghurs being forced to make shoes in concentration camps in Xinjiang province of China, whether it's children harvesting cacao and ivory in the Ivory Coast. there are lots of areas where trade data can become part of the, the sleuthing that goes into finding out how clean or not our supply chains are, or the supply chains of the major companies who sell these goods to consumers like you and us.
Let me ask on that, as you're talking about the companies and kind of getting as whether these are sins of omission or commission. At least Americans will tell pollsters, whether they'll actually do this in practice maybe is a separate question, but that they would prefer not to buy goods sourced by slave labor, made in places where environmental and labor standards aren't followed. Is there a sense that the data is just simply hard to track because of bureaucracy, or do companies prefer not to be able to have to call attention to this precisely because they don't want the bad consumer reputation there? At least they want to be able to have that plausible deniability of saying, we thought everything in the supply chain was fine, and as long as we weren't alerted to something, then we can say, well, we didn't know. Is this a sense that this is, as you said, these are arcane rules from the 1930s, the data can be hard to track, or do you have a sense that maybe companies are happy to keep these rules arcane because it may avoid unpleasant public relations issues at the consumer end?
It's not just public relations. I mean, there's legal implications as well. There are laws on the books that prohibit, the importation of goods made from slave labor. The Uyghur Act that was just passed is very tough, and a lot of companies fought that. So I think it's not just PR. I wish it was just that, but they also very much are concerned about the fallout. Look, I mean, I want to be clear. I don't know how much, I've seen those same polls. The consumers definitely attest to wanting goods that are produced in an ethical manner, but I don't think a lot of people spend time looking at this issue, to be frank. And, what they probably want more, especially in a time of, heightened inflation in the United States, is they want the goods to arrive cheaply to their doorstep. So, I mean, there's a little bit of double talk on all sides. The consumer side, people want their cheap goods and they don't really want to do the homework. Sometimes that's required. And on the industry side, I think, they have some initiatives. They all have corporate social responsibility statements now, environmental and social guidelines. I think a lot of companies do honestly believe in those guidelines, but they're sort of belied by actions like the one that we raised in the story. I mean, this quasi-governmental advisory committee, it's called the Commercial Customs Operations Advisory Committee, had the great idea of proposing to Customs and Border Protection that they make all the data confidential, including the 50% that right now we have some limited visibility on, which is the goods coming in on ship. This goes in the complete opposite direction of what they profess publicly in their corporate and social responsibility statements. So I think it was important to sort of highlight that issue. There's also been, action taken in the courts by companies, by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce to basically say, look, we can't be held responsible for what happens to our suppliers overseas. This is an extraterritorial overreach by the U.S. justice system. And although we, do our best to make sure our goods are not, being made by slaves and in hostile working conditions, it's not up for the U.S. courts to enforce that. That's better addressed by private industry and Congress. Look, I think this is precisely why it's important for journalists and citizen reporters to have access to this data. I think a lot of the government is overwhelmed, and I think the industry has a natural incentive to not be as forthcoming, let's say, with some of this data.
Can we go back to this I guess, proposal from the Commercial Customs Operations Advisory Committee? So supposedly it's now being looked at by the CPB, the Customs Border Patrol. Do you have any sense of timing on this? And part two of that question, which I find interesting to your point about, do people really care, or how invested are people when maybe we should ethically be more invested? There was a sentence there that the CPB came back to your query and said, well, this proposal was developed with information from public meetings. what public meetings? I mean, how does one how does one go to a meeting of this advisory committee? Is it truly public? And you know, this is where I'm getting at, for us to activate our doorstep, because I do also think that's our role, is to share this information and say, hey, well, this is really going on. Are these really public meetings? Are they publicized?
So these are good questions. I'm asking the same ones. I should say for this story, I reached out to 3 of the members of the committee, the ones that I name in the story, just because they're big names that all of us know. None of them commented to me. I did hear back from one of them, but I have not heard from anyone from the committee itself. Yes, these meetings are public. I don't think a lot of people know about them. But they are public. My understanding is, they had one in September, I think, in Chicago, and I think there's an opportunity for virtual participation. In terms of the process itself, I think this is still very early stages. So there will be a chance for people to make their voices heard. Let's face it, this is an advisory committee. The ultimate decision is up to the CBP. My understanding from talking to some experts is that, this committee was tasked by the CBP to come up with proposals to streamline rules and regulations. It is taken very seriously. It has obviously access that the general public does not. The members of the committee are all vetted. It's not just, self-appointed. It's not an industry group. The government actually, they serve, I think, 2-year terms, and the government knows who's on the committee. The story came out the same day that this committee, members of the committee, were meeting in closed door sessions with CBP as well as other agencies like, I think, Treasury. I saw the DEA was on the list. So they have a real foot in the door that perhaps the public doesn't have. But I don't believe that this is just, something that the CBP is going to rubber stamp. I mean, to be fair to the CBP, these are not their proposals. This is the proposals of an industry group, which I think, rightly or wrongly, feels that they're being forced to meet additional compliance measures, and they want some sort of, not just stick, but they want some sort of carrot on the part of regulators to just, make their job as freight forwarders and importers a little bit easier. I was told about 1/3 of the proposals traditionally are accepted. Another 1/3 are sort of deferred for lack of resources or needing a little more additional study. And then 1/3 are kind of just rejected. So it's a proposal that has legs just by virtue of who is proposing it, but it is not a done deal. And, I think, hopefully maybe our story and other groups that have voiced their outrage over this, this will probably not go forward. But it does show you some intent on the part of companies who, like I said, they talk about cleaning up their supply chains and being, responsible corporate citizens. But I think, in blocking out access to this information, it really goes in the opposite direction of what they're avowing publicly. I also want to say something that's very important, and I'm a little reluctant to reveal this, but I didn't know this either. There already exists a mechanism by which companies can make individual shipments confidential. I didn't know this until after my story was published, but there are certain processes and certain eligibility requirements, but basically, even for that small part of the pie, that 50% that comes in on vessels, there's like 22 categories that you need to fill out on a customs declaration form. There's already a process in place where big importers, people who have a track record for doing things right, can request that certain amounts of that data be confidential. So, I don't know how many companies are really taking advantage of that. I understand not that many right now, and I don't want to certainly give anyone a good idea, but there's definitely already mechanisms in place to address what is a legitimate concern on the part of the importers of, hey, we want to have our business information confidential. We don't want our main competitor to be tipped off on how we're sourcing a product that we can sell to the public for 20 cents cheaper or whatever it is. I'm definitely sensitive and understand that companies do, worry about this. And in fact, I know that many companies do, the same thing as journalists. They look at the data as well to get that, competitive leg up. It's perfectly legal, but obviously if you've worked hard to establish a business relationship in China or somewhere else, you want to protect that, sort of first mover advantage and not have, the guy down the street, come and steal a supplier from you. So it's very complex. It's not just one dimensional, but I do think that overall, given how of much of a priority for our society, both Republicans and Democrats have come together and said, we do not want products made from slave labor coming from China or anywhere else. Given the fact that there is a domestic manufacturing industry in the United States that really also has been pushing for this, and I think, again, cuts across the aisle. It's one of those rare issues where I think Republicans and Democrats can find a lot of common ground. It is important that, we not lose those extra set of eyeballs on this data, and that we can all sort of, play our role in holding people accountable when maybe sometimes unknowingly, but they're using, suppliers that aren't really doing it in an ethical way.
Yeah, and I do want to mention, because it is in the story, we are talking about big companies that have global reach, like Walmart, GM, Intel, so I want to kind of say that too. You do mention them in the story. So these aren't people that maybe, we'd be worrying about their profits. So I think from that side too, I think we have to look at, well, what can they pay for in order to improve transparency and meet their ethical obligations. I wanted to, though, you mentioned that this is an issue that goes across the aisle, but there is also a business lobby, and you do mention this case in the story, this Chamber of Commerce case. So I'd like for you to kind of bring us up to where it is today, because I think that's also an interesting case of, maybe this is a bipartisan issue in Congress, but definitely there's the business side is pushing, as you alluded to earlier in our talk, to not have these links to what's happening abroad because it's extraterritorial reach.
That's right. The same day this proposal came out, it happened to be, there was a friend of the court brief filed at the appeals court in Washington by the Chamber of Commerce. They got a great lawyer to write it. And it was actually on a case that had already been decided in the company's favor, but an activist lawyer sued the big tech companies, Google, Apple, Dell, Microsoft, on behalf of dead and maimed children from, I believe it was the DRC, the Democratic Republic of Congo, because they were supplying cobalt that was used, I think a lot of it was processed in China, but that was eventually used in products that we all purchase, electronics. The case was dismissed by the district judge for lack of sufficient ties to the working conditions on the part of the American companies. And the Chamber of Commerce, the decision was appealed by the lawyers for the children. And the Chamber of Commerce decided to file this brief, and they basically said that, they played the victim themselves. I mean, basically saying that these, forced labor provisions and laws that we have, add substantial legal and reputational costs on the companies that transact overseas, and basically just asking the court to reaffirm the lower court's decision. And, it's basically saying that they cannot be held responsible or liable for what's happening, down their supply chain if they didn't know about it. Again, I think it just is, you can't have it both ways. It seems like if you want to talk the talk, you got to walk the walk. And, some of the activists that are quoted in my story are very critical of that court filing by the Chamber of Commerce. I'll just leave it at that. The truth is there are serious concerns about our supply chains. I became interested in this issue personally because of seafood. I've done a few stories on seafood imports, and we have a relatively new seafood import monitoring program in the US that only covers 12 species. Some of the most threatened species, I might add. And this is important. 90% of our seafood in the United States is imported. Well, there's a report to Congress that NOAA, the regulatory agency NOAA, does every 2 years. And it found that when it audited companies importing these 12 species, something like half of them failed the audits. I mean, that means by the government's own measure, potentially half of this stuff is illegal fishing. Some of it may just be clerical errors, people filling out the forms wrong, whatever. But, that goes to what I was saying. The government can't handle the volumes that we're talking about. And, kind of like drug trafficking, where, I used to work in South America, where the drug traffickers just send boatloads of the stuff and it's sort of worked into their cost system that some of the shipments will get caught. And, there's plenty of fish rotting on US docks because it's been stopped, inspected, and failed. And, lo and behold, these single purpose vehicle, importers don't show up to claim it. So, there is definitely concerns about our supply chains in the US. And I just don't think the answer is to make it harder for the public to trace those supply chains. It's got to be, I believe, to make it more visible. And I think you'll see, hopefully, a lot more groups, activists, and legislators coming along to demand that we not just prevent, proposals like the one that this committee is making, but that we try to open up the other parts of our import data set that currently are and have been for decades closed.
So you have seen an effort to open rail and freight and airplane data.
Well, there's an interesting case about airplanes, which, I get into a little bit in the article, but in the mid-1990s, there was legislation, don't ask me the name, that was passed that actually required airline manifests to also be made publicly available. It lasted on the books for like 3 or 4 months, and then another piece of legislation came in, and as a kind of like as a rider, the air cargo industry shut it down, and in a different set of legislation, basically disavowed and closed that loophole. Now, this was challenged in court because, in fact, the original law, the first law, has never been taken off the books. It was just sort of superseded by this subsequent law. And, 2 trade data platforms, Panjiva and Import Genius, sued unsuccessfully. They lost their appeal as well, but basically arguing that there's not clarity here, and that, in the absence of clarity, the air manifests also need to be made public. They've lost. I understand that they may be considering refiling in a different jurisdiction, but air freight manifest would be seen to be the candidate closest to being reopened, I guess you could say, or open for the first time. But right now, I think the clearest and cleanest way to do this would be additional legislation. And I don't know if there is appetite or not in Congress for that, but I do think it is an interesting case of an issue that could potentially enjoy bipartisan support. Democrats and Republicans, I think, have all voiced concern about supply chains in China. They've all voiced concern about the decline of American manufacturing. So, this is potentially a rare case here where we could see some action.
I wanted to pick up on that last point because that's exactly where my thinking on this was going, which is, the domestic American side of this, right? It's not just simply a matter of, human rights violations, environmental and labor violations overseas, but also that this could be used by everything from American fishermen. I didn't realize the percentage of our seafood that comes from outside of the United States. You always think, particularly in New England, of thinking about how much is supposedly locally sourced, but that American companies could basically make the case of our supply chains are clean, they're secure, we don't have these issues. Do you see much of a groundswell? Are American companies pushing domestic manufacturers allies in trying to make this information more public, because it would seem to be good business if you're a domestic shoe manufacturer to be able to say you want to be able to advertise about how your corporate rival's shoe made in China or Vietnam or Bangladesh has all of these problems, but made here in the good US of A, minimum wage, environmental standards. Is there a sense that it's not just activists, but that also domestic American firms may want to join on this simply for the reason that it may just be good for business?
Yeah, I was pleased to see that a letter was sent to the CBP commissioner from 38 different groups. Among the signatories, I noticed, was the AFL-CIO. Look, yeah, the US has a highly regulated industry. I mean, whatever industry that is. There are some things that the US industry will not be able to compete with from a cost perspective. But, you know, as consumers value the way things are manufactured, they need to be, I think they can be pretty certain that the conditions in the United States, whether that's workplace hazards, whether that's environmental regulations, are going to be some of the best in the world. And you know, that should give people more certainty when they buy, that if they buy an American product, if they buy American seafood, for example, that it's caught in an ethical way. And I know, again, the seafood industry pretty well. These guys would love, you know, to bring more of a light on these issues because they are the first impacted on it. I mean, shrimp fishermen in the Gulf of Mexico, or, you know, long liner fishermen all across the East Coast. They've seen their numbers decimated over the years, but I can just tell you, they comply with standards of integrity that do not exist elsewhere in the world. I mean, they literally get dinged and fined for catching one, you know, fish that they shouldn't have, or, you know, going over their quota. I mean, I'm not trying to say they're perfect, but I know that the regulations here are far better. We have requirements that observers need to be on boats. In many places now in New England, for example, there are requirements that cameras be placed on the boats so that we can evaluate what's actually going on when they're at sea. These don't exist elsewhere. And so, you know, this will be interesting to see if they form an alliance with environmentalists. I mean, environmentalists traditionally have been very critical of some of these groups in the United States as well. But I think in this case, there's a growing realization that American manufacturers are not the worst. And there's a bit of a balloon effect here. You know, we highly regulate the industry in the United States, but, you know, the seafood industry is global. The fish don't respect national boundaries. You know, if we're gonna protect our waters in the United States and sort of really keep a close vigilant eye on American fishermen, doesn't necessarily mean our oceans are going to be any better. There's just a transfer effect by which the problems are pushed beyond our borders.
I think that looking at the seafood industry as perhaps a role model of transparency might be the next topic of conversation for another time. Thank you so much for your time today, Josh. We really appreciate it.
Great. Thank you for having me.
Thanks for listening to The Doorstep, sponsored by the Carnegie Council for Ethics in International Affairs. For more, go to carnegiecouncil.org. Stay healthy and safe.